we're going to be shifting gears from talking about artists who are kind of in this loose category of new realism or nouveau realism, to talking about Fluxus proper. And we watched this short video on John Tinsley. And any thoughts about it? Because we watched that right up until the very end of class. Any thoughts or comments before we move forward?
I just find his work kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, but it's also like, it's just not the way things are supposed to work in my mind.
Yeah, it's unsettling, right? There's a certain kind of maybe this kind of disruption almost in a sense. Yeah.
It was interesting how he could build something that appeared to be so fragile,
Mm.
but it worked mechanically.
Yeah,
Sense.
yeah. But
I was expecting most of his work to just be falling apart in the middle of what it was doing.
yeah, and I think in part too that the work at MoMA is probably his best known piece. That's one that's often talked about and gets reproduced. And that one does self-destruct, and he did other kind of self-destructing projects too. And so I think people tend to have that in mind, but a lot of his work is not intended to function that way.
I really liked the pieces that were like the squares of like black or blue with the floating shapes in it.
Yeah,
Like,
those
that's
are
just like I
really
could just
good.
sit here and watch it for hours.
Yeah, and what does it remind you of? Or does it? Yeah.
It reminds me of it's like that Dada piece with like the little collage squares. I don't remember what it's called. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's probably Jean Art, the collage. Was it collage arranged according to the laws of chance?
Yeah, that's what just kinetic.
Yeah, it's like that made kinetic. I find when I look at those pieces, and actually before I saw this video, I had never seen those before. Like I didn't know anything about them, and I had that same response. I was like, oh, it reminds me of suprematism, of like Kazimir Malevich, those kind of blocks and shapes of color and activated, which so I think they're really interesting. It's like looking at an abstract painting that moves. Okay.
I think like the fact that it was there's also like noise, like a lot of the pieces make noise. It's kind of interesting because like some of it was a little obnoxious, but other parts you were like surprised and like you didn't expect maybe it to make that much noise or that sound in general.
Yeah, there's kind of a full range of maybe softer sounds, and maybe part of the kind of disturbance comes from that too. I think the one where you hear that kind of clanging sound, I think we all were like, oh, yeah.
Could you imagine working in a museum or someplace that has a lot of those? And so like some little kid just comes up and starts banging on it for hours.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, we often consider museums to be very quiet places. Like people, I think it's interesting because when people go into museums, they tend to behave as if they've gone into a church or a temple or something. They become very quiet and they talk quietly and they try not to disturb people around them. And I think a space like this has all the qualities of just classic, sort of museum space, but very certainly active visually, but active in an oral, or auditory sense as well. One of the things that struck me as interesting, and actually, again, before I had seen this the first time, I was unaware of it too, were the pieces that he did in the Nevada desert, the self-destructing pieces. And I think those are interesting, and I think it's worth calling attention to because, it's the difference between doing a self-destructing piece in the courtyard at MoMA at New York and a self-destructing piece out in the desert in Nevada that's not too far away from where the atomic bomb testing, was taking place. And I think that's interesting because, especially too, when you see work like this, it is kind of mesmerizing and fascinating. It's almost like if I say Rube Goldberg, do you know who Rube Goldberg is? Most of you, if not, yeah, it's kind of like a a real life sort of Rube Goldberg device. Or has anybody seen the film The Way Things? I think it's How Things Go, The Way Things Go. Is that familiar to you at all? Lots of fun. Well, I'll track down I have a video. The whole thing. It's like an hour and a half or so. I don't know how to describe it. It's a German. I think he's an artist, but I'm not sure that he is an artist. He basically has this huge warehouse, and he sets up all of these devices that it's like flame and fire and like gas fills up in a soda bottle and then explodes and then tips over something. It's also very Rube Goldberg-like. And I think it was made in the 1990s, so it's a little bit more recent than Rube Goldberg. I also might have done a trailer for it or something. It'll probably explain it in a nutshell. And I totally lost my train of thought because I thought about that. Where was I going with this? well, we tend to see them as this, it's kind of, in a sense, kind of self-referential, in a way. We think of it as art, in an art context. But, one of the self-destructing pieces in the desert making references, to atomic testing, and also, too, within the time frame, within the 1960s, the Cold War, is raging. There's a deep concern that the United States and the Soviet Union, from the 1950s really until through the 70s, there's this deep concern that the U.S. and the Soviet Union is going to destroy themselves and the world along with it, by getting into a hot conflict or a nuclear conflict in particular. And that's something to keep in mind because this is what's in the air during this time frame. Also in the 60s is the time frame of the Vietnam War as well. So the Vietnam War, the beginnings are actually back in the late 1950s. It's officially over in 1974, but it's really ramping up and it's really intense from the mid-1960s, especially 1969 and 70 is when it's at its peak. And I mentioned that too because as we talked about Fluxus, we'll be talking about some artists who are concerned about the war as well. So I think it's important to keep all of these ideas in mind because it's the context in which this work is made. So I think his work is interesting because I think in a lot of ways, or this seeing that reference in this video is interesting because a lot of times his work is seen as these interesting mechanical, objects and and they're almost toy-like. I mean, they're on a big scale, but they're almost toy-like in a way. But there's a seriousness about them at the same time.
When you mentioned
Uh-huh.
that it's toy-like, we recently did a field trip with Wayne Science Center.
Oh yeah.
And they have in the lobby something similar to his work, where like it's self-perpetuated, but it's mechanical and a lot of movement.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's it's interesting to have like an experience, seeing something like it or similar to it. And we think about it within the context of the broader context of art as well. To make work like this and call it art, it would certainly be perplexing to a certain number of people today, but even more so perplexing within the time period that it's being made. So somebody like Tingly's really continuing to push the boundaries of what is considered acceptable under that heading of art. We can also think of it as I lost my train of thought. I think I had a bunch of technological issues this morning. I had to reboot my computer and then this one, and so I think that I'm not on the way I want to be on. I'm curious as to how many of you are familiar with John Cage. This will help as we go into Fluxus as well. Who's John? I've got a couple of hands. Frank, did you raise your hand? Yeah, who is John Cage? Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Who is John? What do you know about John Cage?
He was like on the piece of
No, he passed away a few years ago.
Like
maybe more than a few
an
years.
avant-garde sort of composer who tests like musical boundaries and like where the music goes into like art, performance art.
Yeah, I think testing musical boundaries, I think, is probably a really good way of putting it. Are you familiar with 433? Do you know about this? 430, Brandon, what is 433?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's,
And there's no image. I mean, there's really no image for it.
It's definitely better than Justin Bieber.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I agree. What, do you like Justin Bieber? Actually, I don't. Honestly, I shouldn't knock him because I'm.
This guy's better than the whole baby.
But it's music. I mean, I can swing back around because we're talking about music.
It's
John Cage is a composer, and that's important.
It's an interesting piece because a lot of people don't really understand the fundamentals of what makes music, and it plays on the whole concept of music, not just what you hear in music, but what you don't hear in music.
Right. And I think especially from the standpoint of performance or performing itself. Because when we think I think sometimes, especially if we're listening to recorded music, we think of music as being something that's very fixed, in a way. There's this standard recording, it's what we hear. You don't hear other things in that recording. Like a perfect studio performance is going to be just exactly what you want to hear. The audio, the singing, music, whatever the case is. Any other sounds are going to be edited out or not allowed, into that recording. But the reality of it is when you're performing live, there are lots of things that affect the sound, right? It's going to be the space that you're in, whether it's enclosed space or open space, the audience, the reaction, and so on. So that ambiance or the ambient, aspect of the performance is really significant. And so for Cage, he was formally trained as in music, but he is also a person that we could talk about as a conceptualist. But again, remember in the 50s and especially as we go into the mid to later part of the 60s, this idea of conceptual art or conceptualism is really just kind of forming, and that term hasn't really been coined yet to talk about. That really kind of comes later in the late 60s. So these people are doing these things and working conceptually without really a title for that. So Cage performs this work called 4 minutes 33 seconds. That's how you see it abbreviated here. And what he does is he comes out. He's got a score. He comes out onto the stage. There's an audience. There's a piano. He places the music on the piano, and he sits there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And because the score is is absolutely blank. There's no musical notes that are a part of the score, and so the performance becomes not about the music that's being played, but it's about that time, that moment in time, the ambiance of that moment in time. And what happens or what happened for the people in the audience is that everybody became acutely aware of the sound of the space. So you could hear sound bouncing around, you could hear people, shifting around in their chairs, or flipping the program, or coughing, and so on. And those are the kinds of things that normally you would try to ignore. You'd kind of edit out, in terms of your own sort of personal filter. So one of the things, and Cage was interested in a lot of different things, but one of the things he was interested in terms of this performance piece is that a performance itself or music or that experience is about the place, and it's about the people who are there and the people that are present in that ambiance that is created. He continued to perform this piece throughout his lifetime, and every time he performs it, it's going to be different because it's in a different space with a different audience. One of the reasons why I mentioned Cage is because I have my remote. Is because he's hugely influential on artists. He also taught at Black Mountain College, which was this kind of this very experimental avant-garde program. It was very cross-disciplinary, fine arts, dance, music, theater, and so on. And he really influenced a number of artists that we'll be talking about really over the next couple of weeks. This is a good quote, I think, in reference to his work. And he says, "Until I die, there will be sounds. There is no such thing as silence." And so when a lot of people talk about this piece, they talk about it as being silent, or this silent piece that he performs in a sense. But there really is no silence, and I think that's important to consider. And that's one of the things that he's getting at. One of the other things that he was known for doing was writing music for what was called a prepared piano. And the photograph on the left is of him preparing one of the pianos. And then on the right is we're actually going to watch a short video, it's about a minute or so, where you see somebody setting up a prepared piano according to Cage's notes and then playing one of his compositions. And if you think about the way a piano is constructed, you've got I don't know what the proper term is, but it's like the sound box in the sense for the piano. Is there a term for that? Where the part where the strings are? Is it sound box? I don't know. Does that make sense though when I say that? It's the part of the piano where all the strings are. The what? It's the guts of the piano, right? And so you have all of these strings that are, kind of the way you tune a piano is to loosen, or tighten them. And so what he does is when you look at his composition, he has notes as to particular kinds of bolts and where those bolts should be placed in the wires of the piano. It's a little bit hard. You'll see it here in a moment too, but you can see some of them here. And he literally, because there's kind of a fairly narrow space in between each of the wires, you can literally kind of twist them, kind of down in between the wires. So he has notes as to the size of the bolts, where they should be placed, and about how far up or down they should be placed, and it alters the sound of the piano in a very interesting way. The other thing too is even though his notes are pretty specific, it's almost impossible for one person to set it up exactly the way that he set it up. So there is also again this expectation that there's going to be this that kind of this variation that happens from one performance to another. And I think the sound is up. So hopefully we'll hear this. What are your thoughts on that?
Percussive.
It's percussive, yeah. Did you say creepy? Did someone say creepy?
I said it's nifty.
Oh, nifty. Okay, maybe I heard creepy. I was like, I don't think it's too creepy. It's percussive, right? And what's interesting too, if you consider piano, it's an instrument that uses strings, but it's considered to be, if I understand it correctly, it's considered to be a percussion instrument because the hammers, when you press the key, it causes a hammer to hit the keys of hit the wires of the piano. So it kind of intensifies that. It almost sounds like some kind of little drums or something.
If I remember from my music appreciation class, I believe that's what he was trying to replicate in that piece.
Yeah,
He was trying to make it sound like a marimba or some sort of tribal.
Yeah, I can't think what that instrument's called, but they're like wood blocks. It has that, almost has that kind of sound to it. And I think too, again, an important thing to consider about it is if you think of piano, it's an incredibly classical instrument, or traditional is probably a better word to use. So he's taking this traditional instrument, pretty traditional practice to write music, compose music, and again in a traditional kind of way. And then to alter it, right? And to also to bring into the element, certainly an element of chance. I mean, even though his notes are very specific, it's the thing about, and again, traditionally with a piano, is that every piano, although again, you might tune pianos differently depending on the kind of music you're playing, but there's this idea you have certain pitches, certain sounds, and so on that you're intending to achieve. So all pianos essentially, theoretically, could be tuned exactly the same. But a prepared piano has this element of chance that's brought into it. So one of the things we see with John Cage, and again, he's a composer and a musician, but is enormously influential on dancers and artists in particular, and choreographers as well, is that it's a kind of like a neo-Dadaism that's at play, and there's a kind of a spirit of neo-Dadaism that develops in the 1950s. Because if we think about Dada and what Dada is all about, it's about the element of chance. It's about embracing that element of chance. And so many Dada works, but kind of the classic, canonical ones that we talk about, basically set up a situation and then see what happens. Or you use traditional medium, or you work with a traditional idea like art itself or sculpture, and then you invert it, in some way. And another thing to consider too is that Duchamp had in the late 50s and in the early 1960s, there were two major retrospectives of Duchamp's work. So he's somebody who is really kind of on people's minds at this time frame. So I really want to kind of talk about Cage a little bit because again he's part of this larger atmosphere, this kind of larger cultural atmosphere that especially that Fluxus is going to come out of. And when after we talk about Fluxus, we'll begin to talk about pop art, and you'll also begin to see all of these connections and correlations as well. I want to show, it's about 6 or 7 minutes long. It's this really nice, short little documentary. It's actually made by a graduate student in Ireland, I think. And it's interesting, and I think it's very typical of how, in some ways, it's really indicative of the way we're thinking about documentaries today, is that we're kind of trying to understand the dynamic or situation in this case. I mean, it has happened in the past, but one of the things about Fluxus is there's still artists who are working today within this category. It's still very much alive at the same time. But you also see the documentarian, I guess the person who makes it, kind of bringing their own thoughts and their own ideas into play. So I think it's worth watching. I'm not able to embed it into the PowerPoint, so I'm going to switch over to Vimeo really quick. Oops. And I think this is a nice way to introduce Fluxus and what it is, because the thing about Fluxus is it's many things, and it has this. Oops, let me make this thing stop jumping up and down. And so I think this makes a good starting point.
A story. Fluxus began through the implementation of an idea and became a significant movement in the development of modern art. Fluxus was a state of mind that embraced freedom of expression through the combination of all mediums. Much like its predecessor, the Dada movement, 1916-1920, it was an anti-art movement which rejected the confines of classical high art. The Fluxus group swore to embrace the irrational and explore the aesthetic.
It's less about the product than the process of getting to the product. John Hendricks, Fluxus artist.
During the winter of 1960, John Cage, an unsuccessful antique dealer and art historian, would inspire a group of young artists through his experimentation with mixed media to create a new form of music. Little did he know these young people would later become Fluxus. Their aim was to be free. They would turn the immediate world around them into pieces of art, identifying the beauty in the obscure and ordinary. They would organize art events displaying photography, paint, sculpture, sound, performance, and film. Fluxus's unique quality was its combination of media. These events were organized by Fluxus founder and enthusiast George Maciunas. Maciunas became a one-man Fluxus by organizing all Fluxus events, publishing their work in magazines and an anthology, and personally financing the group. As the years progressed, the money ceased, and the artists became impatient with Maciunas' organization. In an attempt to spread the word of Fluxus and maintain order, Maciunas made himself the chairman of Fluxus. However, this failed to change anything. As other artists became more popular, Maciunas grew paranoid of his colleagues and more penniless. He began to accuse Fluxus members of betraying the idea of Fluxus and drew up a set of rules to exclude others and define Fluxus for its members.
Machunas, for me, falls into a space of almost being used by these concepts, balancing them out with his own absurdities, clown-like ways, and interesting personality. Alison Knowles, Fluxus Artist.
We're trying to find it, or create it, or recreate it, or do something real. Or can.
Because it's not a film with a narrative, so
it's not a real enjoy. It's not just fact, like it's really like it's more like soul searching, isn't it?
it's just a waste of time. It's just
In an effort to obtain funds for Fluxus art, Machunas merchandised Fluxus through the sale of stickers, serviettes, tablecloths, and t-shirts. By performing this act, he was in fact neglecting the true nature of Fluxus, which was originally created to combat capitalist-driven high art. Their idea that Fluxus was unattainable or deniable by any man or woman was contradicted by this practice of business over artistic expression. During this period, Machunas told a close friend he was living on $5 per week on what he referred to as a Spartan diet. In 1978, George Machunas married one of his tenants through a Fluxus performance. 3 months later, he died of cancer.
To say anything too definitive is destructive to the spirit of it. The minute you pinned it down with writing, you are in a way destroying it or missing the essence. John Hendricks, Fluxus Artist.
Many historians note the death of George Machunas as the end of Fluxus movement. However, after his death, artists continued producing Fluxus work. One school of thought argues that Fluxus was a period of exploration in art history, which ended with the death of its founder. The other argues that Fluxus is still being produced today. Is Fluxus subject to the confines of time and space, or is it more than that? Can an ideology have a beginning or an end? Regardless of this argument, it cannot be denied that Fluxus was a crucial stepping stone in the development of avant-garde art. Fluxus is, and always will be, free.
I think that's a nice project. So I don't expect that to be definitive as to what Fluxus is. But questions on Fluxus so far? Let's see. So based on that, what kind of sense of Fluxus do you have? What visually or the content?
NPR, so it's anything opposite of what we classically conceive of to be art.
Yeah, it's sort of all embracing. I mean, it can be that, but more certainly.
The name's really appropriate since it's like by its nature, it resists clear definition.
Yeah, and that's
easy to define it.
yeah, and that's a tricky thing. Like, how do you define something by saying that it's not definable? You know, or it's brilliant. You know, at least you kind of see it. You know, the name Fluxus comes from the word flux, right? And flux refers to change. To be in a state of flux means to be in a constant state of change. And Fluxus is really coming out of a time period in which there is huge change. There's huge, social upheavals, certainly in the post-war period, especially as you get a little further away, out of the 1940s and 1950s and into the 60s. And so this feeling of change, is definitely in the air, and I think that's a part of what Fluxus is all about. So with Fluxus, we have things like, and one of the reasons why I think this little video is kind of nice, because some of the films that you're seeing, those black and white films or Fluxus films, certainly they've got their own footage interspersed with it. But when you look at Fluxus art, film is really important. Film is new media. And if you think about film, you can talk about it in different kinds of categories. There's cinema, or the movies. There's this, narrative, stories that are told that are really for popular consumption, so, that's certainly a new media, especially of the 20th century. But increasingly, artists are becoming interested in the possibilities of film or film as an art form or a fine art form rather than as again, this kind of kind of mass media method of storytelling. So film is important, things that are performative in nature, but also this idea of paying attention to daily routines or everyday things. And one aspect of Fluxus is to do things that are very common, but to do them with a great awareness, and to kind of bring the common, and this is a way that's sometimes thought of as attempting to be anti-elitist, right? And that's sort of a knock against traditional art forms as being elitist. So that's something that we'll also talk about as well. The documentary also talks about George Maciunas, who's considered to be the leader of the Fluxus group. But I think that documentary also does a pretty good job of giving a sense that there's some tension with that he's sort of like the self-proclaimed, leader, and that some people define the end of Fluxus, in 1978 or 79, when he dies. But the reality is that Fluxus still is very much alive and active today. I'm curious for this, because you guys have you've taken different classes. Do you talk about Fluxus, or have you gotten Fluxus projects and other classes? I think sometimes.
Some of Colin Williams.
I know Colin's done some Fluxus things.
Yeah, but he never really mentions it as Fluxism.
Mm-hmm.
Usually he refers to Dadaism or something.
Yeah, and Fluxus is oftentimes referred to, but some aspects of pop art, and Fluxus is oftentimes referred to as neo-Dadaism as well, or that's used, as a way to describe it. Yeah. Okay, was it the multiples class or collectively you made projects? And that was and that's a direct reference to Maciunas, who was putting together these Fluxus boxes of objects. And in part, and the documentary mentions this too, in part those were created to raise funds, was to, in a sense, kind of not on a huge scale, but to kind of mass produce these objects as a way to continue to fund Fluxus projects. So I think it's interesting when you look at the self-portrait of George Maciunas here. What do you think when you look at this image? How does it strike you?
It reminds me of one game with Magritte.
Oh, of Rene Magritte. Yeah, I could see that.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, because I actually wasn't even thinking about that. But I think that's notable. When we think about Magritte's painting? When was that made? Yeah. Yeah, it's pre-war, right? So it has this kind of dated quality to it. So here's Maciunas in 1965 wearing this, kind of suit and tie, a monocle, bowler hat. I mean, he's out of time in a sense. It's sort of an anachronistic image in that respect. And it's also very conservative as well, which I think is kind of interesting. So the way he's, promoting himself in this image is at odds even with what Fluxus is all about. This is the documentary talks about the manifesto. This is the manifesto that he comes up with, and this is when he was really trying to, in a sense, sort of calcify or more clearly define what Fluxus was all about, which is again difficult to do because it is about being very open-ended. And it's important to understand we're going to talk about a number of artists who are associated with Fluxus or are connected to Fluxus in one way or another. But Matt Yunus is kind of the leader and not at the same time. I think maybe the best way to think about it is that Fluxus kind of, Matt Yunus, via Fluxus puts this idea out there, and so many people respond to it. It's this powerful concept or idea, and it's time that they kind of run with it, and it becomes really an international movement really quickly. So one of the things he does here, and again, this is a very quick and dirty kind of way of creating a text here. He's got some but dictionary definitions. This is essentially kind of a photocopy type process. So he's got these these kind of standard definitions here, and then these handwritten notes. And those handwritten notes are notable because it tells you what some of the concerns are. So one of the things that he says in it is that it's to purge the world of bourgeois sickness, intellectual in quotation marks, professional and commercialized culture, purge the world of dead art, imitation, artificial art, abstract art, illusionistic art, mathematical art, purge the world of Europeanism. He's invented that word. So this idea of Europeanism, he's making reference to Europe, right, and European. But that word pan means it's something that crosses, right? So what he's getting at there is this idea of Europeanism. There are these European ideas that have become standard, or these kind of European ideas about art in particular. So this is where he's really kind of attacking, in a sense, the status quo. And then in the next handwritten part in the middle, he says to promote a revolutionary flood and tide in art, to promote a living art and anti-art, promote non-art reality, which I still have yet to figure out what that is exactly, to be fully, and he's got that marked out, to be grasped by all people, and not just critics, dilettantes, professionals. So again, he's getting at this idea that art is something that's elitist, right? It's being held by this relatively small group of people, certainly the artists themselves, but curators, collectors, the intelligentsia, the culturati, who are within those art institutions. And this idea of Fluxus is to bring it, to the people, literally bring it to the streets. And then that final note is to fuse and to bring together. So he's talking about these as being very critical of institutions, and then he's talking about bringing things together at the end. So to fuse the cadres of cultural, social, and political revolutionaries into united front and action. So this is really, in a lot of ways, typical of radical language of the 1960s. To be critical of institutions, to rally people together around a common cause. And so I think that what we can talk about Fluxus is this really broad thing that has an extensive life. When we're looking at this, we can see it as very much of a product of its time. I think we're speaking of time. We're almost out of time. When we come back on Wednesday, we'll talk a little bit more about Matt Yunus. We'll talk about some of his projects, like this early one in Wiesbaden. And then we'll begin to talk about some other Fluxus artists, see Fluxus variations, and also bring it into some much more current